Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you are in for a treat today. The reason is I'm in for a treat because we've got Andrew Hopkins. We're going to take a look at the intersection of AI, data compliance, and data ownership. So, Andrew, with that incredibly long winded introduction, first of all, welcome to a fellow Texan and welcome to the podcast.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Andrew, could you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Yeah, most of my recent career has been in consulting, and I've worked with companies large and small, focused on what I call outcome-driven business support. And so I've seen a lot of things, done a lot of things, and a couple of years ago, when I left big consulting, I ran into the company with whom I'm working now, PrivacyChain. And that's where I've been, and PrivacyChain blows my mind, so I'm glad to be here to share a little bit about it on the concept of AI and data and compliance.
So, how do you see that intersection of AI, data, and compliance and data ownership from maybe a 30,000 foot view?
Yeah, look, AI has shone a spotlight on problems we've had for years. The issues of data security, data control, privacy, compliance, rights enforcement have been around forever. But what AI has done is shine a spotlight because essentially we've magnified the importance of data in the context of what I call the AI process, which is taking raw data, running it through a refining process, and then delivering knowledge out the back end. And in the context of AI, essentially AI is the refining process in the middle. But data's always been there. Data supposedly was the new oil, but really it's coal. It has to run through the refining process, now known as AI and large language models, and to deliver knowledge. And so the problems are just magnified. Garbage in, garbage out is now on steroids, and the issues that we've known for a long time, it's just got a whole lot worse.
GIGO. I absolutely love that. I learned that term in college, and little did I know 50 years later, I'd be using it again. Amen. Okay. Many of the listeners to this podcast are in the corporate compliance realm, but we have a large number of other corporate senior exec types that listen. And how do you sit down and have a conversation around managing and securing data? Are you talking to a CISO? Are you talking to a board of directors? Are you talking to a general counsel slash CCO? All of the above? None of the above?
All of the above, although I will say the CISO is actually the most difficult because if you just bring it back up for a second, think about it in the context of just security and compliance. What we're doing today is managing the perimeter. If you think about what we've done with data management and data protection for 40 years, we bring everything into the middle, stick it into a data center or on-prem servers, and then we build infrastructure around it. And that model doesn't scale, particularly with the variety of data, the volume of data, and the vast amounts of data, and it just doesn't scale. But we still continue to do the same thing. So when we start talking about different ways of thinking about data and perhaps changing the way we've done things for 40 years, the technology conversation is actually the most difficult because it's a bit of a change for people from the way they've been thinking about the data for years. But when you start to talk about it from a business standpoint, it makes a ton of sense. And those conversations are a lot more fruitful, to be honest.
Who do you have the conversation about data governance with? Is that with a board or senior exec? Or once again, is that with the CISO type?
No, the people who really need to care about it are the board and the senior execs, the CEO. I mean, they are ultimately accountable for this, particularly in the exec ranks. The CISO is focused on the methodology by which compliance and security and ownership rights need to be managed. But the accountability sits with the board. And if you're a company large enough to have a compliance or a governance department, that's a key place to start.
In 2020, the US Department of Justice issued guidelines for compliance professionals, which didn't suggest but explicitly stated that a corporate compliance function and a chief compliance officer had to have access to all data silos and all data lakes across an organization, not simply data related to a compliance or the effectiveness of a compliance program. How would you help a CCO type think through the questions he needs to ask to find out what data is out there? So, maybe sales data, maybe marketing data, maybe supply chain slash procurement spend data. How does someone like me, a lawyer by professional training, sit down with someone who may be in a more technical function and ask, what is your data and where is it?
Yeah, you're asking for a miracle in most big organizations. Look, you hit the key thing. It's siloed, right? And it's extraordinarily difficult to look across silos to pull a comprehensive view of data. And one of the huge challenges that tends to get forgotten is that a vast amount of data that we have today is no longer necessary, and it's scattered. And that's one of the other challenges. We kind of have an ability to look within the cloud and look within servers. But how much data in the average organization is sitting out on your laptop, even on your phone, even on your home devices, given the last few years of working from home? It becomes very difficult to do it. So the questions are, as you would expect, what do we have? Do we still need it? What controls are sitting around it? And how are we managing compliance? But they're extraordinarily difficult to answer with current technology and the current way of thinking, because you have to bring it all together, and it isn't all together. And it's hard to pull all that information out, particularly given the dispersed nature of data. Everyone thinks and talks about cloud, but a ton of data sitting outside the cloud. And it's often sensitive data. And that's where you start to run into trouble, because you don't have visibility in the way that you should to all of that data across it. So the questions are fairly obvious in my mind. Perhaps I'm oversimplifying it. Getting the answers is really tough.
Are there any industry sectors that you have observed are more affected by these constraints, or is it really industry agnostic?
It's industry agnostic. It becomes down to a couple of things. One is the sensitivity of the data. And obviously, healthcare is an obvious one. Financial services is another one. It gets a little grayer, partly because the players are driving this in the context of personal data through things like social media and big tech. That's a whole can of worms to dig into, because essentially you are, as an owner, giving up your data to a large degree to those technologies. And the application of rights are a little flavored, shall we say, by the terms and conditions that you use for that big tech. But there's a lot more cut and dried in the context of healthcare and PII and HIPAA and all those types of things. So that's one thing. The second thing is the value of data. And I think specifically around things like intellectual property, trade secrets, which is a massive cybersecurity issue. And cyber criminals make hundreds of millions of dollars every year from stolen intellectual property. So you've got to look at it from both senses as an organization or an industry. But every organization has some duty and some value in managing and controlling their data. It really depends upon the type of data and what it's being used for, and the regulatory compliance that they have to achieve.
Let me turn to some of the shortcomings of current data management systems. And why do you see them falling short of resolving modern compliance issues, Andrew?
This goes back to what I was saying earlier, when we are essentially storing everything in the middle. But the second key thing that we do and have done forever is we store what we call dumb data. And I'm going to use an analogy that hopefully works. When you store data today, it's essentially like taking a bunch of 2-year-olds and putting them in a field. Now, those 2-year-olds have no idea where they came from. They don't know who they shouldn't talk to. They don't know who they shouldn't take candy from. They don't know where they should be. They don't know where and how to talk to each other. And so what you then have to do is get a whole bunch of adults and stand them around and in the field to tell these kids what to do, to take care of them, to stop them from talking to the wrong people, and so on. And that's what we do with data today. If you just think about the fact that we strip out metadata from data, put it somewhere else, in a table somewhere, we're storing dumb data, which means you have to build infrastructure around it to control it, to make it compliant, to make sure that it's being used in accordance with what the government's department and the company wants to do with it, or the organization wants to do with it. That does not scale. It's very expensive. And particularly when you get into the distributed world, how do you take all those adults and replicate them on your laptop? So it's very challenging, and that's the problem, because the approach relies upon the infrastructure that sits around a store of dumb data, and that's what we've been doing. And that becomes very difficult, particularly with the volumes of data and the importance of data in the context of AI. I'll add one more thing to it. data integrity has now become a big thing, right? And data integrity means provenance, lineage, but it means context. And we don't store data with context. And so then you run into things in AI where the data that you're feeding into your model to train them and to run inference has not got context attached, which means you can get some very strange answers, and you really can't rely on it. So the fundamental issue is the fact that we've been doing this thing for 40 years, and it's a top-down, outside-in approach to data.
Could we maybe explore that concept of data integrity a little bit? Because I've not heard anyone raise that before. And then you use the term context. So I don't want to sound completely befuddled, but I may even be more befuddled. How, let me fall back to my lawyer training. It's black and white. It's the law or not the law. I can interpret the law. Maybe our interpretation's based on prior cases, precedent, or maybe it's a new interpretation based upon a different reading. Is it that issue? Is it Tom's interpretation, or is it the black and white law or case that I input into AI?
It's the context of the case, and I haven't thought about it in the context of law specifically. But silly example, if you're entering data about Apollo, you're talking about the Greek god or a spaceship. And the other part of it is, where did the data come from? Look, we all know the Russians are using bots to push a whole bunch of fake data into the online universe in order to manipulate some of this stuff, and that's happening. So when you're running an AI, how do you know the data is actually, you can trust it? Do you know where it came from? Do you know who's had access to it? You don't have provenance, you don't have lineage, let alone the context within which the data was generated or was used. And that's where things start to fall apart in the context of AI. And I guess in a case, in a legal case, I could be, if you don't have the metadata associated with the case and the context around that case, it might not be obvious, like location, year, or whatever there might be extenuating circumstances around the case. Then you don't have the complete picture, and you're complaining and you're training the models and running inference without a complete picture of the data, and that is a problem.
Let me see if I can use this example. I don't know if you can see this, but it's Sherlock Holmes FAQ book. I'm a huge Holmes fan, and indeed, I have a podcast series where I've done the entire short story oeuvre in the context of corporate compliance investigations, leadership, and business ethics. And now I'm working on the novels. This book gives me the summaries of those stories, which I can use in the podcast to generally describe the action before I get to the analysis. Is it incorrect for me to use someone else's summary rather than going to the original A. Conan Doyle source material? Or is that just a potential risk I need to factor into what comes out?
It's a risk, because the summary by definition is somebody's opinion of what the summary should say. And perhaps an example is, when you're looking at a summary of factually what happened, perhaps you're losing the context of the characters and why they act in particular ways or why their history. So the summary is a factual summary, but in context of why people perhaps the way they do or what and feel the way they do, you might lose that. But that's important when you start to think about how that information feeds into a model and what it means in the context of future experiences. Because cultural competence is a really classic example of where things fall apart, because cultural competence is not obvious in a summary like you're suggesting, but it's crucial in the context of how AI is used and knowledge is used at the back end. Does that help?
No,
Let's make it worse.
no, it's in the short story, The Second Stain. It's about a story of obsession where a man chases two men literally from America to Europe to London, and he kills them both. And I knew the story. I'd seen it on television in various interpretations. I sat down and read the novelette. There was about 15 pages devoted to why he had that obsession. And the reason why was someone had stolen his bride before he could marry her to marry someone else, then tortured her to keep her in chains and then had her killed. And with that context, I understood why would he chase two men literally across three continents or two continents if the English do consider themselves parts of Europe. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. but it really added to my understanding of the story. It So that's sort of point one, but also let me go to your citation of Saturn. That seems to me to be handled in your prompt. Are you finding situations where people will enter Saturn and they don't say, not the Roman god Saturn, but the NASA and Apollo program to get the Saturn rocket to get to them into the moon on the Saturn rocket on Apollo?
So the prompt can certainly guide the nature of the answer. I'm thinking more about it, and look, I'm not a huge expert in the way LLMs work in particular, except that they're essentially playing Scrabble, because they are. Let's face it. It's what's the next word that gives me the best score, and that's essentially how it works. And yes, I'm being very rude, and I'm going to get lots of rude calls about this, but that's essentially how it's working. But if you're training it, does the training provide that context? And so it's learning from text that might not have the relevant context, which means that the answers it will give and the words it'll select may not have the context, even if it's written into the prompt. That I could be wrong about that, but that's the way I think about it.
Let me change the subject just a little bit, or focus, I should say, to PrivacyChain, your company, and your approach to rethinking data control and compliance. How do you help companies sort of rethink that approach? Is that a top-down strategy? Is it a bottom-up education who then convinces top management and or the board? How do you communicate your strategies around this? And tell us a little bit about your work at PrivacyChain.
Yeah, look, PrivacyChain, let me first explain what it is, if I may. And I'll use the analogy that I was using about kids in a field. When PrivacyChain stores data, it stores adults in a field. And I'm not, unless you want me to, I won't go into the how. But essentially, you've got a bunch of adults in the field who do know where they've come from. They do know who they shouldn't talk to. They know how to talk to each other. They can answer a request from across the field saying, everybody with this characteristic, put your hand up. And so they're able to respond and to manage themselves and secure themselves and control themselves without needing a bunch of adults standing around telling them what to do. And all those adults that we had managing kids go away. And so you're fundamentally changing the way that data is managed from dumb data to self-aware data. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we can do it on any device at all, right? Because we're a distributed data management system, which means that I can sit on your phone and govern control and give you complete control over the data on your phone. So it's a fundamentally different way of approach, which is a good thing and a bad thing, which is another long story. But so given that, the conversation is best top down, because the conversation starts with a business value, because the values associated with that, depending on the industry, can be very material and can be foundational to the success of a business. And like a good true consultant, I'm looking for the problem associated with the person with whom I'm talking, which can be different. It's a very different conversation in the world of content and podcasts and monetization of content and trying to reverse what Napster did to music 25 years ago. At the same time, there are conversations with drone companies. The thing about PrivacyChain is it's a data management system and anybody can build on it. We're sitting behind the applications that you use every day and providing a better level of data management and ability to do things that you couldn't do today with the existing centralized approach. So it's a very problem-driven approach, and preferably a top-down, because the technical conversations can get quite interesting, particularly with people who've been doing traditional data management for the last 30 years or 20 years or for all their working life. But the business conversations are very compelling because we're solving things that in a different way. And our approach is very much, because we built a platform, our approach now is to find people who have issues that we can solve with our unique approach to data management.
Let me turn to the future of personal data ownership. And I was really intrigued by your thoughts and work in this area. Could you explain what this concept is and maybe some of the benefits and challenges in shifting data control from institution to individuals?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. Technically, we now have the ability to give you control over your data. And because we're sitting at source, because we're a distributed platform, when you click save on this podcast, or you click save on a version of your book and it goes onto your server or your laptop or whatever it is, That's where we are. That's where PrivacyChain sits. Save2 and PrivacyChain has it. So what that allows you to do to have complete control over what happens to that individual piece of data. So you can take this podcast, you can say, Andrew, do you want to have a look at it before? You can review it, you can't edit it, but now you have control over it. But it works for everything. The question becomes much more, it's a business model question. If you go back to big tech, if I sign up and I use Facebook, I'm essentially signing my data away. Technically, we could allow a social media company, a big tech company, to build a platform and a very similar service, but it would give you, the user, complete control over your data, down to a very granular level. So do you want to share your date of birth? No. Do you want to share the year of your birth? Okay, maybe. And how much you're going to pay for it. So you're able to move the control of data into the hands of the person generating the data. And obviously it works in the same way with an enterprise. One of the things that we look at very carefully right now is the concept of data sharing. And data sharing is massively hampered because people do not want to lose control of their data because of HIPAA, because of compliance, because of regulation, and because there's often proprietary and important data they don't want to share, which really hampers things like healthcare, research, and various other industries. When you retain control and you're giving access to your own data, you're retaining control of it. So now you can safely share, and you can share exactly what you want to share under the conditions that you choose to set. So it manifests itself in very different ways, but you as an individual, if you go back to my example of big tech, if you sign up for Facebook, you're giving your data away. If you sign up for a different service that allows you to control your data, that's great. But what's the business model? How does that organization now make money based upon the fact that most of these big tech companies make money out of selling your data? So it comes down to a business model in many cases. The other thing that comes down to is usability. We've had some interesting conversations around healthcare. If you own your data, Tom, you're in a position to actually manage it appropriately. My 97-year-old mother is not. So how do you, again, it's not a technical question as much as it is the use of the data, and does it make sense for someone to own it? And if so, under what circumstances? And so that's where we have most of our conversations around privacy. But yeah, from the point of view of you owning your own data, you can absolutely do it. And this sort of gets into the whole Web3 thing that was which is still around, but was all the rage a couple of years ago. The whole idea of ownership of digital assets and all this stuff, which got very sidetracked, shall we say, by the idea of tokens. But yes, you can own your data, but the question is, does it make sense?
So, Andrew, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you, find out more about PrivacyChain, or really any of the topics you've touched on today, what might be the best way for them to do so, or best place or places for them to go?
Before I answer that, Tom, I hope you've had fun. That was one of the things I wanted to make sure it's a fun topic. But yes, very quickly, I think you're going to publish my LinkedIn profile. And please go ahead and publish my email. It's andrew@theprivacychain.com. But please feel free to publish it. And I'd love to talk to people about this. I get up every day, even at my advanced years, and I love what I'm doing. And it's important, and I'd love to see other people benefit from it.
You're the first person to ever use GeiGo and Scrabble in the same podcast that I interviewed them. So on the fun scale, we hit 11, and I learned about, on the scale of 1 to 10, about 15. So you hit both markers great. Andrew, I hope we can continue this conversation.
I would love to. And thank you again for having me. And we'll talk soon.